I'm comparing two men from England who took up mission work in the late 19th century on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean for the Church Missionary Society, or CMS. It was one of the main two overseas arms of the Anglican Church. So first there's William Duncan, who was a lay missionary, and he founded a self-sufficient Christian village where between 60 and 600 Tsimshian converts lived and worked. The community was called Mitlaka, and it was on a small island not too far from Prince Rupert. He led the community from 1862 until 1887, when the entire community moved to Alaska due to a property dispute with the Missionary Society. It had its roots in a doctrinal and personal disagreements with CMS leaders. Duncan died at New Mitlaka in 1918, but the descendants of the original inhabitants of Mitlaka still live there today. The second man is John Batchelor, who was appointed as a lay missionary to Hokkaido in northern Japan in 1877. By 1885, he was the longest serving of 8 CMS missionaries in Hokkaido. He had managed to complete his pastoral training and receive ordination while on furlough in England, and he was married to the head of the Hokkaido mission. The Batchelor took responsibility for ministering to the indigenous Ainu and used this position to build a reputation as a world expert on the Ainu, publishing several books on their ethnology and language. So the more I study history, the more I am drawn to the late 19th century. In this period, there was global extension of technological, political, and intellectual structures that are integral to our lives today. So this is the time when European imperialism achieved its fullest extent. So Britain alone extended her dominion over 1/3 of the Earth's surface, and even tiny Belgium was able to impose its will on a vast swath of African territory. The story of European imperialism, or the rise of the West, as it's sometimes called, can teach us a lot about where we find ourselves today. But it's a story that has been told so many times that it often does more harm than good. When it becomes the default narrative, it privileges the agency of one group of people while marginalizing that of others. So this paper is just a small attempt to decenter this narrative a little bit without losing sight of the realities of 19th century colonialism. So on the one hand, it's impossible to deny the fact that both of these men were active and enthusiastic participants in colonial processes that triggered a cross-cutting set of changes to ethnic, gender, and cultural structures. And that when combined with horrendous demographic decline brought on by the introduction of crowd diseases to unresistant populations, these changes were disastrous to the economic and the spiritual well-being of both the Ainu and the Tsimshian peoples. But on the other hand, as missionaries, both of these men were playing games with two different rule books. While most participants in the colonial project encountered indigenous peoples as a byproduct of their activities focused on settler society, missionaries entered into the indigenous societies and tried to effect change from the inside. They had to struggle to maintain credibility in both native society and the settler societies. So I think this potential for ambiguity and hybridity in colonial missionary work makes it an interesting place to start looking for ways to deflate the colonizer or colonized dichotomy. So to construct a theoretical framework for understanding the way these men interacted with, negotiated between the institutional values of the missionary society and the different values embedded in the societies in which they worked, I've drawn on Brian McKillop's concept of the moral imperative. So in an influential book called A Disciplined Intelligence, McKillop looks at Canadian scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century and argues that they were torn between a desire for progress and scientific achievement on the one hand and Protestant religious values on the other. He describes it as a desire to create new knowledge and explore new possibilities, existing in tension with a desire to maintain certainty of conviction that manifests as a moral imperative, which ends up transcending its theological roots. So McKillop traces this development of the moral imperative from the mid-19th century social gospel movements to its influence on the establishment of the social sciences in Canadian universities. So I found this to be a very useful concept because the Church Missionary Society, as an institution, as well as Duncan and Batchelor individually, were inspired by the social gospel movement. But my departure point is that the tension for these two men, rather than between religious belief and free scientific inquiry, is between their commitment to the cultural apparati attached to their religious beliefs and their sympathy for the value systems and cultures of the Ainu and Tsimshian. So I've also been inspired by Anne-Laura Stoller's exploration of intimate domestic relationships and their interplay with socially constructed categories of race, gender, and class in colonial societies. So Stoller argues that both colonizers and colonials learned about themselves and the other as much through intimate domestic relationships as through the formal political sphere. Perhaps even more so because these intimate relationships, by their nature, complicated the neat categorizations through which the primitive colonized and the civilized colonizers were separated. So as missionaries, Duncan and Batchelor occupied ambiguous positions in the contest to define and separate the civilized from the uncivilized. So on the one hand, they had a strong moral authority by virtue of their spiritual mission, but the very mission required them to cultivate intimate relationships outside the boundaries of civilization and potentially undermining their status as arbiters of these distinctions. So I've used the official history of the Church Missionary Society as a benchmark to define the institutional and doctrinal values that drive this moral imperative. And I hope a little bit about the way that Duncan and Batchelor understood and reacted to the indigenous values will come out in my analysis. But for this paper, I haven't tried to fully reconstruct these value systems. And this isn't because I don't think they're any less valid. It's just because that it's the missionary society values that create the connecting link between these two men. In my dissertation, I intend to delve into the larger colonial context in Hokkaido and take into account, as much as possible, both Japanese and Ainu perspectives. So on the 16th of June, 1851, while London was entertaining the world with its first great exhibition, a special service was held at Westminster Abbey to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the CMS, in which Queen Victoria's consort, Prince Albert, addressed 500 worshippers. He made an explicit connection between the Great Exhibition, which he described as a festival of the civilization of mankind, and the work of the CMS. He stated that this civilization rests on Christianity, could only be raised on Christianity, can only be maintained on Christianity. On that day, the Prince shared the podium with the likes of Prime Minister Lord John Russell, the Archbishop of Canterbury, several members of Parliament, and other minor dignitaries. So the content of the Prince's speech, as well as the distinction of the men that could be attracted to celebrate the achievements of the CMS, illustrate the degree to which the society and its activities were seen to be firmly embedded within the metropolitan power structure and compatible with the goals of the official goals of the British Empire. So according to the official history of the CMS, the missionary's job was to prepare the ground for the establishment of proper British institutions, essentially making himself redundant by folding his native flock into the local Anglican parish as it emerged in colonial society. In lands where the British flag did not fly, such as Hokkaido, missionaries were expected to establish a church with a strong native leadership, though there was some debate over what form that church should take. But the reality was that, despite its vital connection to the center of metropolitan power, the CMS lacked any real authority outside the realm of the moral and the spiritual. And even within that realm, it had to struggle with a number of other causes and religious movements that also depended on the church going public for volunteers and funds. As a chronically underfunded and understaffed organization with personnel and assets spread across the globe, the CMS was not always able to effectively ensure that its missionaries behaved as expected. In fact, there were very few strong disciplinary methods at its disposal, and none of them would be effective against a missionary who could secure his own funding or was well entrenched in the mission field society. So to a large extent, each missionary was left to their own devices in interpreting and executing their missions within the local context. So following from this, Duncan's job would have been to assimilate his congregation at Metlaka as closely as possible into the developing Anglican Church and settler society in British Columbia. But he embedded himself so deeply into Tsimshian society that it was impossible for him to fully perform this assimilative function. He became a powerful authority figure with an overwhelming concern with regulating behavior and enforcing outward compliance to strict rules of conduct. Under Duncan's control, Metlaka became a self-sufficient economic unit with a lumber mill, a couple of factories, and its own fleet of trade vessels. But Duncan achieved this level of control by taking the role of a traditional Tsimshian leader, protecting his people and redistributing wealth obtained by collective labor and trade. So Duncan completed his mission insofar as he brought the values of industry and commerce, as well as strict religious observances, to his flock. But he vigorously resisted all attempts to integrate them into the Anglican Church or settler society. In part, this was due to a doctrinal dispute with CMS leaders over the appropriateness of high Anglican ritual in the Metlaka Church, but it also stemmed from his determination to protect Tsimshian women from ungodly white men. But shortly after the establishment of Metlaka, Duncan, who was never married, opened a girls' mission home in his own house, where he provided care and education for orphaned, abandoned Tsimshian teenagers. So at this time, British Columbia was going through a shift in domestic moral values as cross-racial matches between men and women became increasingly unacceptable in the wake of a growing white society and the spread of social Darwinist theories. So not surprisingly, Duncan's motivations for opening the rescue home were heavily criticized in Victoria and in London. He came under intense pressure to either take a white wife or to close the home, both of which he refused to do. So these disagreements became increasingly heated over the years, and I'm sure contributed greatly to Duncan's decision to leave the CMS and move the community to Alaska. I can't say whether what Duncan's true relationship with these young women was, but whatever its nature, it's clear that his commitment to the local indigenous community overrode his commitment to the predominant moral and social values of the CMS, as well as of the colonial society in British Columbia. So in many ways, John Batchelor had a much easier task set for him in Hokkaido. Well, he had to negotiate 2 layers of culture and language to minister to both Japanese and Ainu. He did not enjoy the protection and familiarity provided by British colonial institutions. He still did not have to take on the complete transformation of the society in which he was working. There was an accepted gray area between the proper expression of Christian beliefs and the perception of unchangeable Japanese and Ainu racial traits that gave Batchelor room to place emphasis on the spiritual and intellectual aspects of salvation, rather than on adherence to the proper outward social and cultural expressions of the faith. What's more, Batchelor was in a situation where he could actually increase his status in missionary and British society while demonstrating a commitment to and understanding of the target society. He was one of the first and longest serving men within a collegial group of CMS missionaries working in Hokkaido. He married the daughter of the head of the mission, and perhaps most importantly, he developed a reputation as a world-renowned scholar of the Ainu. Through this scholarly work, Batchelor was able to articulate for a British audience a narrative of the future of the Ainu. He depicted them as a dying race, fading away under the onslaught of more vigorous Japanese settlers. He argued that, while regrettable, nothing could be done, since this was simply God's will. It seems that Batchelor presented his work among the Ainu as somewhat akin to a performance of last rites. It was not necessary to bring the Ainu to a high state of civilization, but merely to give them the opportunity to hear the gospel before they were gone. Between Duncan and Batchelor, there's a large difference in the personal and emotional commitment toward the fruits of their activity. Where Duncan sought the authority to enforce, Batchelor sought arguments to persuade. Because Batchelor was able to articulate his mission to the Ainu on a more abstract level, there was less danger of compromising his standing in the eyes of the missionary society by failing to deliver. However, there is evidence that Batchelor's personal commitment to Ainu communities was more involved than he let on in his formal writings. In the summer of 1881, as a young single man, he lived in the hut of Chief Penry in the Ainu village of Piratori. He occupied a corner of the single-room dwelling house that was shared by the chief, his wife, and younger children. Batchelor dwells on his relationship to Penry in his writings, while creating distance between himself and Penry's wife. Over the years, Batchelor returned to Puritory many times, and Penry often appears as a character, usually as a comic character, in his writing. But it's interesting that 12 years later, when Batchelor returned to Puritory to perform his first baptisms of Ainu people, he baptized 171 women, almost the entire population of the village, and no men were baptized at this time. So I think this suggests that Batchelor's relationships with Ainu women had more depth and intimacy than would have been appropriate for him to express in his formal writing without threatening his moral authority in the eyes of the metropolitan audience. Even more telling is the fact that the Batchelors brought a teenage Ainu girl named Yayako into their home, eventually adopting her. But there's no mention of this girl in any of his writings. By bringing an Ainu girl into his family, Batchelor gained the same level of authority and intimate access that Duncan had exercised at the rescue home at Metlaka. But in Batchelor's case, this could have been acceptable in the eyes of the society, as it demonstrated the couple's commitment to educating the Ainu, while allowing them to perform the nurturing function that was integral to the Victorian concept of marriage. The Batchelors had no biological children. But in writing about Ainu marriage customs, Batchelor stated that it was a terrible disgrace for an Ainu couple to have no children, as it was assumed that one of the couples had committed a terrible sin. To explain this belief, he cites the Ainu word uare moshiri, which he translates as multiplying world, and explains as a powerful desire of the Ainu to increase and multiply. And I wonder if the Batchelors adopted Yayako to remove the sin associated with being a childless couple in Ainu society, and perhaps to make a symbolic gesture about their commitment to an Ainu uare moshiri. Thank you.